Today we're making the Gina puff sleeve top by Tiana's Closet Patterns. In this sew along, I'm using a medium weight linen with just enough structure to maintain the puff in the sleeves. There's elastic in the top and bottom of the sleeves as well as in the casings on either side of the shirring. The pattern itself is excellent, and I hope you join me for this sew along to create a beautiful top that you'll love. And I'm hoping that this sew along takes a lot of the guesswork out of it for you too. Let's get started. Here are my main center front and side front pieces, and I'm going to place them right sides together and pin matching the notches. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now that the main front is constructed, I'll place the main side back pieces right sides together with the side seams of the front piece and pin. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Repeat to create the lining, attaching your center front and side front pieces as we did previously, so that my constructed bodice pieces for the main and the lining so far are identical. Here is my sleeve piece, and I'm going to finish the top straight edge using my serger. And then press that top finished edge of the sleeve to the wrong side by 3/4 of an inch all the way across. Then sew close to those finishing stitches all the way across to form a casing. For the top of the sleeve, I've cut a piece of 1/2 inch wide elastic to a length of 14 inches. Now I'll attach a safety pin to one short end of the elastic. Draw your elastic through the casing and then baste both ends of the elastic in place. Now for the bottom of the sleeve, I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges, and I'm going to fold that bottom edge to the wrong side by 3/4 of an inch and press all the way across. Then I'll unfold that hem for now and fold the sleeve in half, matching the short edges, and pin. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seam toward the back. Now we can fold up our bottom hem along our pre-pressed line and take it back to the sewing machine to sew close to our finishing stitches all the way around to form the casing. Leave a gap of about 1 inch so you can insert the elastic. Cut a piece of 1/2 inch wide elastic to match the circumference of your bicep measurement. Now you can draw the elastic through the opening that you left in your stitches. Then overlap the two short ends, zigzag back and forth to secure. Then we can pull the elastic entirely into the casing and sew closed the gap in your stitches. Repeat to create both sleeves. Now we're going to start attaching the sleeve to the main bodice piece. Placing the sleeve and the main bodice right sides together, match the underarm seam of the sleeve and the side seam of the garment and pin in place. And then match the top hem of your sleeve with the seam that connects the center front and side front piece. And pin. Pin the bottom of the sleeve with a side back panel, noting that the side back panel will extend a 1/2 of an inch beyond the hem of the sleeve. Do the same for both sleeves, and we'll baste these sleeves in place. Place your peplum pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew the side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press them toward the back. I've also finished the raw edges all the way around the bottom edge, and now I'll press that hem to the wrong side all the way around the bottom by 1/2 inch. Then we can top stitch that hem in place all the way around, sewing close to those finishing stitches as we've done previously. Here is my center back piece, and I've gone ahead and finished the longer top edge. Now I'll take it to the ironing board and press that top finished edge to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. Now that that's pressed, I'll stitch from one side to the other along the finishing stitches to create a casing. Now for the bottom of the center back piece, I'm going to find and mark the center. And I'm also going to find and mark the center of the top of the back peplum piece. I'm going to place my center back panel and back peplum piece right sides together, matching the center backs, and pin in place. Then I'll continue pinning together along both sides of the center back piece. Now we can sew the center back panel to the back peplum from one side to the other, starting and stopping our stitching 1/2 inch away from the raw edges of the back panel. Now I'm going to finish those top raw edges of the peplum and the center back panel from one side to the other, just as far as that center back panel. Turn that center back panel over its seam allowance. Once that's pressed, I'm going to create the casing by stitching from one side to the other, edge stitching along that finished seam of the peplum skirt, once again starting and stopping my stitching 1/2 inch away from the raw edge of the center back panel. Now I can start loading my bobbin with elastic thread to prepare for the shirring. I'm going to wind the bobbin by hand, just winding it loosely until it's about halfway full. Then I'll snip off the thread and load the bobbin into the machine as usual. Then I can start sewing the shirring into the center back panel, horizontally from one casing to the other. I'm going to sew each row about 3/8 inch away from each other, and I want the top machine thread to be on the right side of the fabric, backstitching at both ends to secure the elastic. I've set my machine's tension to 9 and the stitch length to 5. So here's my shirred panel. To further shrink up your shirred panel, take it to your ironing board, applying a lot of steam. Cover it above the panel. This will gather the panel even further. Now quickly, before I place the elastic in those 2 channels, I'm going to sew basting stitches all around the remaining portions of the peplum. I'm going to do these basting stitches in 3 sections. From one side of the center panel to the side seam, leaving thread tails on both ends. Then from the side seam straight across the top edge of the front peplum, leaving thread tails at both ends. Then starting once again on the other side of that seam, sewing basting stitches to the opposite end of your center back panel. Now I'll cut a piece of 1/4 inch wide elastic to measure the length of my top row of shirring. Then I'll cut a second piece to measure the length of my bottom row of shirring. I'll take the top elastic and lace it through the casing, and then lace the second length of elastic through the bottom casing. Then take it to your machine and baste each of those edges of the elastic in place. Now we'll take our main bodice piece, the one with the sleeves attached, and place the side back panels right sides together with their corresponding sides of the center back panel. pinning it in place so that the top and bottom of the side back panel extend 1/2 inch beyond the hemmed edges of the center back panel on either side. And you should be able to access that seam allowance of the shirred panel because we left that seam allowance unsewn earlier. And then we can sew those seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now that the main bodice is completed, place the bodice and the peplum right sides together along the waistline. And then at the seam allowance on either side of the center back panel, I'm going to snip into the seam allowance to the stitching line but not beyond. That will free up that peplum seam allowance so that we can get a clean pinning all the way around. I'm going to first pin at both of the side seams, and then pull my basting stitches for each section so that the peplum fits the bottom of the bodice. And once it fits, pin in place. Now we can sew that waistline seam from center back to center back, backstitching at both points to secure. Now that the waistline seam is finished, we can press the seam allowance up toward the bodice and also press those shirred paneled seam allowances toward the side backs. Then turn your garment right side out and turn your sleeves downward so that you can access that interior seam. Place your lining right sides together with the main bodice, matching your seams and sandwiching the sleeves in between, and pin in place all around the upper edge, from center back to center back. And make sure to align the vertical raw edges of both of your side back pieces at the seam. Then sew from one side of the shirred panel all the way around the top of the main bodice to the opposite side of the shirred panel with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now that the lining is attached, we can turn the lining away from the bodice, and we're going to understitch. Press the seam allowance toward the lining, and then sew the seam allowance to the lining with about 1/8 inch seam allowance from one side edge of the lining all the way around to the opposite side edge. Then turn that lining entirely to the inside of the garment. And give that top edge a good press. Now on the inside of the garment, we're going to cover the exposed seams with a 1/2 inch lining seam allowances tucked under along the center backs as well as the waistline. Place those folded lining edges over the seams and pin in place. Pin in place from the outside. Do this to cover and conceal both side edges of the shirred panel, as well as those raw edges at the waistline. So here is the outside of my garment with everything pinned in place. Now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch of all of these covered seams, starting at the top edge of that shirred panel seam, down and all around the waistline, until you're back at the opposite edge of that upper shirred panel seam. As we stitch in the ditch, we'll be catching that folded edge of the lining on the interior. Give everything a nice press and your blouse is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss notifications every time a new sewing tutorial comes out. And I'll see you in the next video.